let's get started.
So let me introduce myself in the course, and then I'll have you guys introduce yourselves. So I'm Cutrone, I'm the instructor for the course, and I teach here in art history, theory, and criticism, but also in visual and critical studies, and I've taught here about almost 22 years. I sometimes teach this grad survey course. Other times I teach the undergraduate, the modern half of the survey course. My area of specialization, however, is critical theory, Frankfurt School critical theory, Marxist critical theory. And my courses that I teach here at SAIC that are most frequent are on Walter Benjamin and Theodore Adorno. They will feature in this course to some extent. And of course, that I teach regularly also is on the philosophy of modernism, sort of basic, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche. And I have a background in social theory as well as aesthetic theory. So there's kind of a connection that I draw between society and politics and art and aesthetics, which is pretty common here at SAIC. I'll tell you guys that I got my MFA here a long time ago, 30 years ago. I got an MFA here. And then I went off and had a little art career, but then I went back to school and got a PhD, and so now I'm an academic rendering artist. Nonetheless, I'm still very much aware of, and I think one of the reasons why I've taught here as successfully as I have is because I'm always keeping theory and practice in mind, especially in the realm of art, aesthetic experience, artistic form. Oh. I also teach at one other school, just a very side thing, where I teach social workers, psychologists, practicing therapists in theory, in epistemology, philosophy of science, and also social theory. So that's me, anyway. The course is structured around the history of modernism from its inception in the 1800s up through its crisis in the 20th century that led to postmodernism. One of the things that I always thought facilitated my capacities as a pedagogue when I started teaching more than 20 years ago was that we were perhaps in a postmodernist era. That might have been premature. We might still be in postmodernism, unfortunately. And I thought that would allow for a reconsideration of what postmodernism tried to overcome or defeat or sweep under the rug or avoid. So that tension between modernism and postmodernism, we'll discuss it a little bit in class today. In class today we'll do some readings together, some short readings. We won't meet for the entire class session today, probably 2 hours. And like I said, I very much have in mind the practice of artists. So some of you are MFA students, some of you are academic students. So we're going to try to keep that tension alive. Now, I am very much aware that MFA, graduate school in general, is about professionalization, not education. Education is for undergrads. Professionalization is for grads. No, we're going to do education here. Meaning this is not going to be about learning to talk the talk. It's not going to be professionalization of learning the lingo. Okay, so I very much forsake the idea of keeping up with the latest theoretical trends and latest discursive kind of jargon. It's going to be kind of old-fashioned and substantial concepts and categories rather than mere discourse. Okay. So the fashions come and go, but some core ideas have not yet been overcome in terms of the modernist and quasi-modernist, postmodernist moment, some basic ideas. Anyway, all the postmodernists decided in the end that Kant was right after all. They all did that. Foster, and Krauss, and Douglas Frank, and Derrida, and Deleuze, they all sort of decided at the end, Foucault, they all decided in the end that they hadn't actually ever gotten beyond Kant after all. So we're going to take them seriously on that one. We're going to take them at their word on that one. So I'm aware of how you guys are here, and I took a course just like this when I was an MFA student, and it was very instructive. I had a very good professor in that course, Lisa Wainwright, if you've heard of her, here at SAIC. I'm going to do my best to try to replicate my own experience in education as an MFA student, as far as hopeful, useful, thought-provoking concepts and categories that are sort of there, kind of lingering in the background, but are seldom directly addressed. So we do our best to directly address those ideas, rather than just assume, not talking the talk. All right. So the formal requirements for the course, it's a moderate to heavy reading load, so not as heavy of a reading load as is typical for my courses, so not quite as bad as that, but almost as bad as that. We're meeting Friday evenings, Friday late afternoon. I know you guys are professionalizing, which means that you have some kind of a professional career or practice, etc. I know that therefore there's liability in being adjacent to the weekend in terms of like professional travel, doing things, whatnot. Do the reading, come to class, try not to plan to miss class. Try not to plan to miss class because you will miss some. However, I am going to be recording the classes, so you can catch up on via audio recording if you so happen to miss class. But like I said, probably don't plan on missing class because there's something about the focus of being here in class that's part of the learning process. Like I said, I'm aware I've taught on Fridays for most of my time at SAIC, and with grad students I never becomes a little bit of a liability the Friday slot. But try not to miss class intentionally. All right. I will be setting up discussion threads for the readings for each week, and everyone will be invited and encouraged to post a couple of bullet points, maybe some passages from the readings you'd like us to focus on. So your response to the readings, or your questions about the readings, or specific particular parts of the readings that you'd like us to discuss in class, so we'll have something in an agenda. Everyone is encouraged but not required, except for I will take a couple of volunteers in. And they will be obligated to post their brief bullet point kind of note items to the discussion thread, and then to verbally present them and elaborate a bit on them in discussion in class. So it is meant to be a seminar class, not a lecture class, although I do have a lot to say. I will end up saying a lot. However, really the point of it is much more Socratic and therefore seminar oriented. And so this will be a way, the discussion threads will be a way of us sort of having an agenda for our discussion, putting some things on the table, and the presentations will allow everyone to lead, to some extent, the discussion. The number of students, the number of class sessions means that everyone will do that twice. So everyone will volunteer to do that twice over the course of the semester. The final formal requirement for the course will be a paper at the end. And the paper at the end will be an opportunity for you to learn through writing. Sometimes we don't know what we think until we try to write it. And just based on the broad swath of material in the course. So not an art history research paper, but much more engagement with the ideas and the meanings of the course. It's a short paper. The prompt is already on campus in the files folder in the course syllabus and writing assignment folder on campus. all the readings are on Canvas, so we don't have any book purchases for this course. They're all PDFs on Canvas. Yeah, so those are the formal requirements for the course. Anything clear about that? Questions about that? Okay. So now I will have you guys introduce yourselves, and we'll go just in alphabetical order from the course roster that we have, and hopefully this version on Canvas has something to do with your preferred identity, how you'd like to be called, addressed, as opposed to the other class roster, which is more like legal names or something. So, yes, can we start at the top?
I'm Tom. I am practicing grad school. I'm Ben. I'm a second year.
I'm Gabe. I'm a first year comics MFA.
Is that its own department now?
It's brand new.
Oh, wow. Cool. Oh, cool. Cool. How many students in the class?
Not like that.
Oh, cool. Great. Francis? Maybe not. We don't quite have the number of people who are there, so we're missing some.
I'm Charles. I'm first year
Phil? You're not? Cool.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm fourth year.
Is Augustina? No? Lawyer?
My name is Long Yu. I'm the first year MFA in
Hi, my name is Xiao Yu, and you can also call me Anu, and I'm the first year of the fashion MFA program.
Hi, my name is Sonia. You can call me Peng. I'm the first year with the radio communication.
What's the name?
Yeah, but I'm
Okay, so that's us. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, hi. Yes. Sculpture. Cool. Excellent. Thanks. All right. So, what we have on our agenda today is a handful of writings that two of which were published around the same time that I started teaching here at SAIC, and one of which is a little bit older, that are useful to introduce some basic kind of themes or ideas or concepts to keep in mind. Also provide us some thesis statements to bear in mind throughout the course for the entire semester. We'll start with something that I just sort of happened to receive as an alumnus of the University of Chicago. So the Alumni Magazine had a profile of a man who used to teach here, used to teach at SAIC, and fellow alumnus of the University of Chicago, that I thought just sort of captured something really well, and personal acquaintance of his. He left Chicago, went to LA to the Gate. That's Hamza Walker. Okay, so let's see what the University of Chicago Alumni Magazine has to say about Hamza Walker in terms of an alumnus profile. Hamza Walker's worst nightmare, he says, is realizing that you are still in Cobb Hall where you took all your undergraduate classes, and I live it every day. It's actually, I used to teach at the University of Chicago when I was a grad student there and for many years afterwards, and I used to teach in Cobb Hall. Walker, whom the New York Times has labeled one of the 7 most influential curators in the country, is Director of Education and Associate Curator for the Renaissance Society, the non-collecting Museum of Contemporary Art on Cobb Hall's 4th floor. Nightmare? Walker's broad smile betrays his enthusiasm for his home turf. Founded in 1915 at the university, the Independent Renaissance Society has helped introduce the city to the works of such artists as Pablo Picasso, Piet Mondrian, Ferdinand Léger, Bruce Nauman, and Cindy Sherman, and established itself as a champion of vanguard art, otherwise known as avant-garde art. Recent exhibitions have included Latter-day stars Felix Gonzalez Torres, Helmut Jahn, Carol Walker, and Michael Outer. This summer, Walker stood in the middle of the Renaissance's 3,500 square foot single-room exhibition space beneath Cobb's north roof, taking a look at the final cleanup from the latest show, Rebecca Morris's abstract paintings. He'd already envisioned the layout for 5 gigantic video screens needed for the next installation, a collaborative work by Berlin-based artist Peter Weltz and choreographer William Forsythe, tentatively titled All the Pretty Corpses, opening in November. Logistical matters, where to place the screens, how high to turn up the volume, when to dim the lights, account for a significant part of his work. Walker explains, quote, I have a very non-romantic view of whatever curatorial labor has become. In working with artists, it is not simply at the level of content, it also involves discussions about the technical requirements. Born in New York City, the son of a jazz musician and a mother who worked several odd jobs, Walker later moved with his family to Baltimore, where he grew up as, quote, a young punk full of rage. What could be more alienating than that? He asks. The time? The 70s. The place? Baltimore. If you guys have seen any John Waters movies, have you seen any John Waters films? That captures Baltimore. And the 70s, yeah, the 70s were rough. 70s were rough. I was a kid in the 70s. 70s were rough. Today, his favorite artists work to alienate the viewer. Oh, that word again. Alienation, he says, turns me on. People who tell him that they just love contemporary art make him suspicious. I distrust them immediately, he says. I don't inherently like art. That's not a given for me. At Chicago, majoring in art history, he visited the Renaissance regularly, but all the while I held contemporary work in disdain, he says. So clearly there was some Freudian dynamic at work. So what would the Freudian dynamic be? It would be ambivalence. It would be a love-hate relationship. Radical ambivalence. Radically opposed feelings about something. Coming to terms with his contempt informed Walker's appreciation of contemporary art. The work is not the source of my disdain or my dissatisfaction or my frustration. The work can only prompt it. He actually welcomes contemporary art's illegibility and hermeticism, and the frustration it can cause a viewer. I do have a passion for it, he says, but it's driven in equal parts by love and disdain. He never imagined becoming a curator. I fell into this, he says. He didn't anticipate making a career of his studies, but he discovered that, quote, after college, any kind of sustained intellectual nourishment about contemporary work is very hard to find, unless you are with other artists. So he focused on becoming a member of the artistic community, working as a public art coordinator at Chicago's Department of Cultural Affairs and volunteering at the former Randolph Street Gallery before he joined the Renaissance Society in 1994. Today, Walker, a tireless traveler and networker, has become known beyond Chicago's art scene not only for his innovative curatorial work, but also for his wide-ranging thinking and writing about contemporary art. published in industry magazines and exhibition catalogs. The New York Times called him one of the museum world's most talented essayists and lauded his storytelling approach to shows. Walker is skeptical of the flattery, stressing that he can't stand narrative art. I agree. He wants his shows to function critically, he says, commenting on how we live now. A good introductory phrase. Art should function critically, commenting on how we live now. This year he received the Manil Collection's Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement, given to a curator in early to mid-career. But while he denies being the art world's dramatic figure and rising star, as local and national newspapers have described him over the past few years, he admits that now he can't imagine doing anything else. Quote, "If you take a domesticated animal out in the wild, it cannot survive. That's what I feel like. This other world where people have 9-to-5 jobs, that's the wild." All right, the next reading is Susan Buckmore's. Susan Buckmore's, she's a different generation, she's a sort of 60s generation, scholar of critical theory, so she helped introduce Frankfurt School of Critical Theory to the Anglophone world and to an American audience in particular. Her first books were on Walter Benjamin and Theodore Adorno. Probably her most well-known book is The Dialectics of Seeing on Benjamin. This is from 1996. This is from the October Art Journal, from which we will be reading later in the semester. And they put out what they call the Visual Culture Questionnaire, where they surveyed a number of people about this new discipline, visual cultural studies, and a bunch of people responded, and hers was, to my mind, the most interesting, not surprisingly, since we have a shared theoretical framework. But let's see what she has to say. The production of a discourse of visual culture entails the liquidation of art as we have known it. Okay, so art and culture, some tension there. Right? If we subsume art under culture, we liquidate art. There is no way within such a discourse for art to sustain a separate existence, not as a practice, not as a phenomenon, not as an experience, not as a discipline. Museums would then need to become double encasings, preserving art objects and preserving the art idea. Art history departments would be moved in with archaeology. And what about artists? In the recently expired socialist societies, so this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, artists printed up calling cards with their profession listed confidently after their name and phone number. Chris Cutrone, artist, call me, email me, go to my website, my Instagram. In recently restructured capitalist societies, artists became caught in a dialectical cul-de-sac, a self-contradictory dead end. Attempting to rescue the autonomy of art as a reflective, critical practice by attacking the museum, the very institution that sustains the illusion that art exists. Artists as a social class demand sponsors, the state, private patrons, corporations. Their products enter the market through a dealer-critic system that manipulates value and is mediated by galleries, museums, and private collections. Tomorrow's artists may opt to go underground, much like Freemasons of the 18th century. They may choose to do their work esoterically while employed as producers of visual culture. Okay, so notice that she comes back to art and culture, meaning when art is liquidated into culture, then artists produce culture, but maybe what they really care about art becomes an esoteric concern that is driven underground. Right, can we even talk about it? Or Or can we only talk about the culture of artists? Their social group identities, their national, ethnic, religious backgrounds. We talk about the art as art. Maybe not anymore, in which case it's been driven underground. Artists' work, this is a thesis statement for us, is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. And she writes, our work as critics is to recognize it. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the artist's work and the critic's work. One of the things that we're going to be thinking about, especially towards the end of the course, but actually we'll start with this, is what is the role of the critic relative to the artist? And if the critics are bad, doesn't that have a negative effect on the artists? Is bad art criticism harmful to artists too? Making their work harder to understand, be comprehended, be recognized. Are artists' work really being recognized? That's the role of the critic. She says, can this be done best, or done at all, within a new interdisciplinary field of visual studies? What would be the episteme or theoretical frame of such a field? Twice at Cornell, that's where she is, Cornell University, or she was. Over the past decade, we have had meetings to discuss the creation of a visual studies program. Both times it was painfully clear that institutionalization cannot by itself produce such a frame. And the discussions among a disparate group of art historians, anthropologists, computer designers, social historians, and scholars of cinema, literature, and architecture did not coalesce into a program. Still, visual culture has become a presence on campus. It has worked its way into many of the traditional disciplines and lives there in suspended isolation, encapsulated within theoretical bubbles. The psychoanalytic bubble is the biggest, but there are others. One could list a common set of readings, a canon of texts by Roland Barthes, Walter Benjamin, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, as well as a pre-canon of texts by a long list of contemporary writers. So we'll be reading Barthes and Foucault and Benjamin. We won't be reading Lacan. Certain themes are standard. The reproduction of the image. The society of the spectacle, that's Guy Debord. Envisioning the other. Scopic regimes. The simulacrum, that's Baudrillard. We won't be reading him either. The fetish. The male gaze. The machine eye. Today, the phrase visual studies calls up 202 entries on a keyword search at the Cornell University libraries. That's when the database was a CD-ROM next to a computer in the library. So now, of course, if you put visual studies into Google, you get like 10 billion results. There is a media library, a cinema program, an art museum, a theater arts center, 2 slide libraries. What are slides? And half a dozen possessively guarded department-owned video cassette players. What the hell is video cassette? If the theoretical bubbles burst, there remains this infrastructure of technological reproduction. Visual culture, once a foreigner in the academy, has gotten its green card and is here to stay. That resonates now, doesn't it? That's like a weird one. I feel like it's only resonated worse and worse over the years. Man. Silent movies at the beginning of our century initiated the utopian idea of a universal language of images, one that could glide over political and ethnic borders and set to right the Tower of Babel. Action films and MTV at the end of the century, that's the 20th century, not our century, have realized this idea in secularized, instrumentalized form, producing subjects for the next stage of capitalism, of global capitalism. Right? So art has a utopian promise, new forms have a utopian promise, but they just end up producing the next round of subjects of global capitalism. In this way, visual culture becomes the concern of the social sciences. Images in the mind motivate the will, wrote Walter Benjamin, alluding to the political power of images claimed by surrealism. But his words could provide the motto as well for the advertising industry, product sponsoring, and political campaigning. Whereas today, the freedom of expression of artists, if anyone even defends that anymore, is defended on formal grounds that stress the virtuality of the representation. The images of art, it is argued, have no effect in the realm of deeds. A critical analysis of the image as a social object is needed more urgently than a program that legitimates its culture. Again, art and culture. Right? So the role of theory or criticism is not to legitimate culture. It's not to say this is a great culture that is represented by this work and we should celebrate it. That's capitalist advertising. We need to be able to read images emblematically and symptomatically in terms of the most fundamental questions of social life. Here's another thesis statement. Works of art need to be approached emblematically and symptomatically in terms of the most fundamental questions of social life. And what are those? Well, she's already given a hint. Maybe capitalism? Maybe. But there are other ways of describing the society. Patriarchy? White supremacy? Settler colonialist discourse? Imperialism? Cisgenderism? Yeah. What about capitalism? What about that one? What about that one? This means that critical theories are needed, theories that are themselves visual, that show rather than argue. Such conceptual constellations convince by their power to illuminate the world, bringing to consciousness what was before only dimly perceived, so that it becomes available for critical reflection. Okay, so art is meant to help bring to consciousness what was before only dimly perceived, so that it can be addressed, discussed. Sustaining the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Allowing us to share in the critical moment of aesthetic experience. She says, I do not understand the description of anthropological models and socio-historical models as antithetical poles of this theoretical project. Any interpretation worth its salt demands both. It needs to provide a socio-historical and biographical story of origins that estranges the object from us and shows us that its truth is not immediately accessible. So that's the work's prehistory. And a story of deferred action, its after history, that comes to terms with the potency of the object within our own horizon of concerns. In other words, how do works from the past still speak to the present? While the internet is the topic and the medium for new courses in digital culture, it is striking to anyone who has visited the internet how visually impoverished a homepage can be. Cyberdigits reproduce the moving image haltingly and the static image unimpressively. And that might not have been changed by high definition and high stream, high bandwidth transmission. It might not have changed that at all. The possibility of computer screens replacing television screens may mean a great deal to stockholders of telephone companies, but it will not shake the world of the visual image. Aesthetic experience, sensory experience, is not reducible to information. Is it old-fashioned to say so? Perhaps the era of images that are more than information is already behind us. All right, so images are not just discourse. They're not to be understood merely in terms of communication or rhetoric. No. Right? She's arguing against things that were very popular, very prevalent, the rhetoric of images. Visual communication studies. Ooh, VisCom. But perhaps discussions about visual culture as a field have come too late. It is with nostalgia that we boycott the video store, whatever that was, and insist upon seeing movies on the big screen. The producers of the visual culture of tomorrow are the camera women, video film editors, city planners, set designers for rock stars, tourism packagers, marketing consultants, political consultants, television producers, commodity designers, layout persons, and cosmetic surgeons. They are the students who sit in our classes today. Looking at you kids. What is it they need to know? What is it they need to know? Not want to know, need to know. What will be gained and by whom in offering them a program of visual studies? Meaning, I don't think I'm here to train the next generation of cultural producers for global capitalism. I am, but I'm going to fight against that as much as possible. I got my memo from my comrade. This is in Buckmorse. What's my duty as a teacher? To teach the students more than the legitimating discourse of culture. Okay. The last thing that we'll read in class, well, theoretical text, and we'll look at the poem, is by Robert Pippen. He's a professor at the University of Chicago. He was a professor of mine. In my studies there, he's a scholar of German idealist philosophy, Hegel and Kant. We also know Nietzsche and others, Heidegger. As a young man, he was a member of the Students for a Democratic Society. He's a 60s generation. And he and his group of friends in the SDS chapter at their school, Trinity College, all went on to become Hegel scholars. As a young faculty member, he got a job at the University of California, San Diego, and he was taken under the wing of one Herbert Marcuse, who's a Frankfurt School critical theorist, who sort of guided him in terms of like the relationship between philosophy and Marxism and politics and society. If you guys have never heard of Marcuse, he was a kind of cause célèbre of the New Left. So he was a professor in California. He was a professor of Angela Davis, black radical Marxist activist. They were attacked and tried to be purged by Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. And the vice president of Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, gave a famous speech attacking the nattering nabobs of negativity, the critical intellectuals, and Marcuse was renamed, but also Angela Davis. And now, I guess, people like Christopher Rufo, do you know who that is? No, you've heard of these Trump people? So anyway, he's someone who was invited in to help reform the state university system curriculum in Florida by Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. And he's a sort of pundit and a kind of, I don't know, right-wing researcher into cultural Marxism, something according to Marcuse, for what academia has become since the 60s in the United States. We'll read a little Marcuse. Marcuse will make a cameo appearance in the course, but later on in the course. So Robert Pippen, let's see what he has to say. So this is a similar short piece written in response to a questionnaire put out by a journal. The journal is Critical Inquiry. And it was the questionnaire sent out to a bunch of people on the editorial board and prominent academics, intellectuals, culture commentators, the current state and future of critical theory. So Robert Pippen writes, other board members, I expect, will comment on the state of matters critical in literature and the arts. There is also, of course, the issue of the status of a critical theory of society. So I wanted to say something about the state and future of critical theory en sich, as such. Essentially, how he's defining it, the left Hegelian, Marxist, Frankfurt School tradition, although the notion has become broad enough so that even the likes of Heidegger and his influential legacy and army of epigones are relevant. Okay, so why is that remarkable? Because Heidegger, of course, was a deep anti-Marxist. Even to the point of joining the Nazi Party in Germany. He kind of centered his whole intellectual philosophical project against Marxism. And then who are the influential army of epigones? I like to call them the French fries. Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Lacan, Althusser. And all of Althusser's students, Balibar, Rancière, Badiou. Right? There are Heideggerians. There are obvious implications for contemporary literary theory, but I won't try to go into that. This will just be an attempt to identify the still unsolved problem. He thinks that there's one unsolved problem. That is the unsolved problem. It will have to be breathless, and I'm not entirely sure it is relevant, but here goes. The historical dimension first. I understand critical theory to be at its core a post-Kantian phenomenon. That is very much a legacy of the original Kantian idea of critical philosophy, a critique by reason of itself. The basic claim is that first philosophy, prima philosophia, which was the foundation of all pre-modern university learning and all pre-modern science, was not, in fact, any longer regarded as first. A critical account of the possibility of such a first philosophy, or any other claim to know, was first necessary. This is immediately subject to Hegel's famous objection that it is like trying to learn to swim before one enters the water, but that's one side. What then does it mean to see Kant or the Kantian moment as the hinge on which something quite new in the history of philosophy and social and perhaps aesthetic theory swings open? The most important result of the all-destroying Kant, because that's what he was called by his critics at the time, was the destruction of metaphysics as traditionally understood, that is, a priori knowledge of substance. Philosophy, non-empirical claims to know, could not be understood as about the world or things in themselves, but rather had to be reconceived as concerned with our mode of knowledge of objects, otherwise known as subjectivity. So philosophy becomes about the subject rather than about the world or things in themselves. Eventually, this would become the linguistic turn, logicism, sociology of knowledge, all sorts of things. But the most important result for later critical theory concerned the status of necessity in philosophy. Why is philosophy necessary? Or Kant's attempt to argue that some philosophical account of the once and for all necessary conditions of knowledge was possible. To make a very long story very short, after Kant, while the critical attack on the very possibility of first philosophy survived, this faith in a formal philosophy capable of delivering an epistemological form of necessary truth did not. Retaining the notion of a subjective contribution to, legislation of, the possibility of representational content, or all aspects of human experience fraught with oughts, and I'll come back to explaining that in a minute, but without the necessity or fixity, meant that it wasn't long before the most important aspect of the Kantian aftermath was apparent. Hegel's famous claim in the preface to the Philosophy of Right that philosophy is its own time apprehended in thought, or that every philosopher is essentially a child of his time. This all meant that some new way of conceiving of philosophy adequate to the realization of the radically historical nature of the human condition was now necessary, especially one that could distinguish in some way what was central, elemental, essential in some way, that on which other quite variable and much more contingent aspects of human historical time depended. The problem of understanding properly, especially critically, conceptual, artistic, and social change was henceforth in the forefront of much European philosophy. And why is that? Because Kant's writing at the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, and what had happened before that? The American Revolution had happened, the French Revolution was on the horizon, and before that there were several hundred years of massive upheavals, revolutions, religious wars, the Protestant Reformation, in which millions of people were killed in religious wars. A major change had taken place, and then the concern of philosophy is, what's the significance of this change? How do we understand this change? How do we understand our participation in this change rather than the change happening to us? It's what should happen. God punished us. No. This was something that clearly was due to human action. He says this is all pretty much a comic book summary. My claim that Hegel is a post-metaphysical thinker, not a regressive theologian, will raise eyebrows, and it leaves lots of gaps, but it gets me to the point I wanted to make. For it was also the time as this consciousness was building about historicity, post-metaphysical philosophy, and so forth, that some consensus was also building in European high culture that the modern form of life coming into view after the middle of the 19th century, and we'll see what the significance of that is, middle of the 1800s, or so, was in some basic way unacceptable, unaffirmable, pathological even, certainly ugly. To cut to the chase, it then became obvious how difficult it would be to theorize, as it is now put, this gap or absence or lack in this new comprehensive form of life. So what is the new comprehensive form of life coming into view in the middle of the 1800s? Capitalism. Capitalism is defined by the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, conventionally dated 1750 to 1850, first 50 years taking place in England, the second 50 years expanding onto the continent in the wake of the French Revolution. You guys heard this term, the Anthropocene? It's with regards to global warming, climate change. So it's dated from 1750. Why? Industrial Revolution. We're going to see there's a relationship between modernism in art and the Industrial Revolution. So capitalism, the Industrial Revolution. Not the Renaissance, not trade and commerce. That's bourgeois society. We'll be talking about that. There's a difference between bourgeois society and capitalism. Capitalism's the unaffirmable, pathological, certainly ugly, comprehensive form of life coming into view by the middle of the 1800s. It says, no appeal to an underlying unrealized human nature was possible. No appeal to an independent moral criterion was possible. And the idea of an underlying historical teleology, such that what was missing was what was not yet actual, but being realized, began to seem a metaphysical regression. This meant that the problem of critical theory turned out to be connected to a very old problem, indeed the oldest, in philosophy, long ago called the problem of non-being. How to say what is not without saying nothing. In this case, it is the problem of theorizing what was historically missing, absent, simply not in this historical moment, and understanding the nature of its claim on our attention. So, he's being a little euphemistic here. So, something missing. So we have this pathological, certainly ugly form of life. Something is missing in this form of life. Socialism, communism, Spectro-voting era, communism, Communist Manifesto, Marx Engels. Why does socialism keep coming back? Why does Marxism keep coming back? Because we're still in capitalism. Isn't that a style? It's back. It's back. And what does it mean? Since it doesn't exist. Socialism doesn't exist. You've got capitalism. Socialism doesn't exist. So how to say what is not without saying nothing? It doesn't exist, and yet somehow it's also not nothing. Communist Party of China will tell you China is not yet socialist. It's taking a path to socialism. It might achieve socialism in 2049. That would be a convenient year, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. But it's not there yet. They'll tell you, it's not socialism. Not socialism. Vietnamese Communist Party will tell you, not socialism. It's not. Not socialism. They're heading towards socialism, but they haven't gotten there yet. If they admitted they're not really going there, then all the people would put the Communist Party and you have a capitalist counter-revolution. So they have to pretend that they're still going there even though they're doing capitalism. They're doing it hardcore. Hardcore. Taking the capitalist road to socialism, which is Marxist. It is. Marxism understands capitalism as the road to socialism, in fact. That's all that capitalism is, according to Marxism. We will see. But the politics and the ideology might matter some. Or, how to understand, theorize the recoil or aversion to modernity already apparent in Holderlin's Nostalgia and other romantic productions. Holderlin, who was Hegel's college roommate. And much more in evidence in Kierkegaard's The Present Age, Nietzsche's Death of God, and so forth. Formulating an adequate account of what was missing, unrealized, or just unacceptable in these altered conditions proved difficult and provoked ever more radical solutions. Right? So we've lived through the last 200 years of a lot of radical change and a lot of radical responses to that change. A lot of radical ideologies, a lot of radical movements, a lot of radical thinking. More so than any other time in human history. He says, I think this problem remains poorly understood and hardly yet well worked out. He says, not resolved by Walter Benjamin's messianism and idiosyncratic philosophy of history, nor in Adorno's negative dialectics and attempted recovery of the non-identical, although he thinks Adorno comes closest, and not in the most radical response to the problem, Heidegger's. What is sought is some sense of the falseness not merely of contemporary philosophical positions, but of everyday life itself. The falseness, deceptiveness, thoughtlessness, and forgetfulness of the ordinary itself. And all this without reinstallation of traditional reality appearance distinctions. Heidegger came up with a novel, explosive account of the inherent nothingness of the everyday world, its potential for an episodic, largely inexplicable breakdown in anxiety and homelessness, and then proposed a vast novel ontological account as a way of thinking through the implications of this distinct fragility and groundlessness. Of course, all that's capitalism. So much for a short history of non-being. I only mean that I think critical theory still needs an account of what isn't in the what is, and still needs to understand the dimensions of this problem as an interconnected problem from Kant on appearance, Hegel on dialectic and teleology, Marx on contradiction, Kierkegaard on despair, Nietzsche on the nihil and nihilism, Adorno on negative dialectics, and Heidegger on nichts, or nothingness. In fact, he says, I would say that the level of discussion and awareness of this issue and its historical dimensions, with respect both to the history of critical theory and the history of modernization, has regressed. And then he lists a bunch of people that he thinks didn't do the trick: Habermas, Foucault, post-colonialism, and deconstruction. He says, so now it is possible to say that the problem with contemporary critical theory is that it has become insufficiently critical. He says, I should say that I still believe that the Hegelian response to the situation, post-metaphysical philosophy, radical historicity, modernist dissatisfactions, is the most promising. It is tagged by such phrases as the causality of fate, internal critique, we'll be addressing this as immanent critique, and determinate negation, and usually involves a three-stage claim. The lack or gap or failure in question is initially the obvious one. A community is not living up to its own ideals. A community is not living up to its own ideals. Or cannot, as in tragic situations. This is then said to have an unavoidable experiential consequence. And he says, a kind of suffering due to its own unreason, and this feature, of course, is why attention to contemporary literature and art can become so theoretically important, as a way of evincing and beginning to diagnose such suffering. Remember what Buckmore said? Symptomatic approach. And then the most difficult claim. The status of the ideal not being lived up to is something like the best we've been able to do so far. And so it is not just a fact about a local community at such a stage that it cannot live up to its own ideal. That failure has significance beyond its local meaning, all of which forces on stage the difficult issue of the referent of the community so described, and the now tired issue of grand narratives. Okay, so the community. What is the community? It's the community of capitalism. It's the community that links everybody in the earth through capitalism. And the grand narrative, what was the grand narrative that postmodernism tried to overthrow? Marxism. Marxism is the grandest of all grand narratives. That's the grand narrative. When you hear grand narrative, it means Marxism. You call it other things, or Western imperialism, really the dissatisfaction is with Marxism. It's the grandest of all grand narratives. Because it says that world history has been united by capitalism. That's a grand claim, grand narrative, isn't it? Regardless of how all this might be worked out, there is also a historical cost for the neglect or under-attention or lack of resolution of this core critical problem, repetition. Essentially, the cost is the rather mysterious repetition, now over several generations, of a number of the original moments of recoil, revulsion, and alienation among the founding formulations in modernism. How long can art be about the end of art? Why did modernist art turn to itself as its subject? How many iterations of what is essentially 19th century French bourgeois self-hatred are possible in the novel before we exhaust that moment? It may seem extreme to claim, well, to claim at all, that such repetition exists, that postmodernism, say, is an instance of such repetition. And also to claim that it is tied somehow to the dim understanding we have of the post-Kantian situation with respect to, let's say, the necessary conditions for the possibility of what isn't. The necessary conditions for the possibility of what isn't. But however sketchy, that is what I wanted to suggest. He says, I'm not sure it will get us anywhere. Philosophy rarely does. Perhaps philosophy exists to remind us that we haven't gotten anywhere. That's a little bit of an echo of a phrase by Adorno, who wrote in his book, Names of Dialectics, that philosophy lives on because the moment for its realization has been missed. So that goes back to the Kant and Hegel stuff. So Hegel said that Kant invented philosophy and he, Hegel, completed it. Before Kant, it wasn't really philosophy, it was sort of quasi-theology, metaphysics, what have you. Kant invented philosophy, Hegel completed it, and the reason it was completed is that now we would live on in society and everyone would be a philosopher. And that's really happened. It's quasi-happened, but not exactly. In other words, there's still philosophy, and there's a new thing, critical theory. Critical theory. And what necessitates that? Capitalism. Why didn't the world become philosophical? Why didn't everyone become a philosopher? Capitalism. So philosophy still exists to tell us that we haven't overcome this problem yet, because we haven't. Okay, to help illustrate this a bit about modernism and modernist dissatisfactions, and the question of the modern, actually. The modern versus the ancient is a poem by a modernist poet, Rilke, from the turn of the 20th century. And German modernism generally operated within a kind of set of reference and discourse of Romanticism. So Romanticism is something that emerged, we'll be talking about this in the coming weeks, in the early 1800s. It's a kind of response to a situation where classicism no longer seems to work the way it did. So the idea of a kind of canon of art, that artists build upon the work of the past and keep that tradition alive and kind of reinvent it, but within the same terms. Romanticism is the sense that there was a loss in the plot and that was impossible to do. So it has a kind of nostalgia, as Pippen put it, for the past. It starts to really uphold classical antiquity, the ancient Mediterranean world. It upholds medieval Christianity, pre-modern Christianity, pre-Protestant Christianity. It starts to uphold non-Western culture. So there's a kind of exoticism and primitivism and celebration of non-Western culture as more authentic than what people had in Europe at the time in the 1800s. So that idea of like a lost contact with a living relationship to reality, experience, subjectivity, humanity. Romanticism. So this is a great example of it, of how modernism is still kind of playing in that arena of Romanticism, because we will see that modernism really is just a continuation of Romanticism in many respects. But with a twist, so we'll see how the twist functions here. So the archaic torso of Apollo, if you guys know this genre of sculpture. So these are fragments, remnants of classical antiquity, of torsos, and why? Because over time the heads and arms and legs have been knocked off because they're broken, and the genitals have been hacked off by iconoclasts, by Christians. And Apollo, who's Apollo? Apollo is the Greek god of form. So he's the sun god. He rides his chariot across the sky, that's the sun, and he casts out rays of light that give form to the world. So he's the form-giving god. And so what does it mean to have a representation of the god of form that is itself a fragment of form, a busted form? We cannot know his legendary head, with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside. Like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs, to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, the stone would seem defaced, beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here, there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. That's the twist at the end. That's the modernist twist. But the message is, you must change your life. And where does that really come from? It doesn't come from the fragmentary form. It comes from the work of the imagination that reconstitutes the form. And that brings it to life again. It's a dead, broken form brought to life again in the work of the imagination, which then tells us about ourselves, that we are alive and free, and that we're tasked with change. So the transformative work of the imagination suggests the transformative task of life. That's the message of art. Right? The artwork is just a dead thing. Comes to life through our subjective faculties, through our imagination, through what our mind does with it. Otherwise, it's just an inert object. In our minds, in our experience, it comes to life. It becomes another subject. It sees you. It looks at you. And what does it tell you? Just change your life. It's the critical power of art. Critical power of art. Allows us to recognize ourselves critically. What does that mean? This is like jargon at this point. Criticality? Critical? No. Critical means something very specific. It means you must change your mind. Doesn't mean irony. Doesn't mean skepticism. It's not the hermeneutics of suspicion, if you guys have heard of that one. It's another French fry. It's Paul Ricoeur. The hermeneutics of suspicion. The masters of suspicion, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, the message of which is to say that we should doubt ourselves completely, be skeptical about any claim to knowledge, about anything whatsoever. No, that's not what they were. That's not the point. That's not hermeneutics of suspicion. No, that's just the embrace of nihilism, without recognizing where the nihilism has come from and how the nihilism is tasking us to do something about it. Not to wallow in it, not to revel in it. To respond to it. That's modernism. We have nihilism in a way that people before never had nihilism. Got it bad. It's not Buddhism. It's not ancient nihilism. The thing that we're struggling with. Rilke, of course, was influenced by Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's famous, infamous for the choice: are we going to be the last man or are we going to be the overman? Are we going to be this dead end of humanity or are we going to overcome ourselves? To recognize the symptom of nihilism for what it was, which is a task. It's not like we just took a wrong turn and ended up where we are. It's not a mistake or an accident that we're here. It's a task. We've kind of lost touch with that a bit. I was with some friends. I was with my husband and his friends. And we went, for lack of something better to do, to the Art Institute Museum. Last night. It was the late night at the Art Institute Museum. And tickets, the Fazal, my husband, and bought our, they said, come in through the modern way. Which then disoriented me. I was like, okay, where are things again? How do we get back to the regular galleries? But it ended up just in the modern way. It was fine. It was cool. But I was struck by the fact that the 20th century modernism, the modern way, it's all post-1900. Where has all this imagination gone? Where has it all gone? Pretty shocking, the level of imagination that people were wrestling with. Not that long ago. Not that long ago. But it's all been museumified. It's all been turned into this like quaint like style or something. It's like, oh yeah, that's modern. This is modern. And it's like we've dulled ourselves to it. So what the artists were trying to do. And so these people were not art people at all. That's not an art person at all. They were friends. They're all Malaysians, so it's him and his friends, his close circle of friends. And yeah, they thought it was cool. One of them, her daughter, might want to come here. That's like so she wants to do fashion and she wants to do art. And she's looking here and she's looking in New York. York, but maybe it didn't tell me what school in New York. I was like, is it Tisch? Is it new school? Is it NYU? Like what? You know, because I was trying to give her some advice and tried to sell her a little bit on the Art Institute, maybe. All right, so fraught with oughts. I promised that I'd explain that, and that will be the last thing that we do today, is where's being and becoming? All right, so use this language of task and change. So let's explain something a little bit. What ought to be? Fraught with oughts. Is the world fraught with oughts? Are we suffering from being fraught with oughts? What does that mean? So, what's the relationship between what is and what ought to be? What ought to be, but what isn't? What could be and should be, but isn't yet. So, what's the relationship between what is and potential and possibility that's not yet realized? What could be, what's possible, what should be. So it has a kind of a moral force to it. That's a task. So another way of thinking about this is being and becoming, which gets us to really the core substance of it, and that's freedom. Freedom understood a certain way, though. So there's an ancient concept of freedom, and there's a modern concept of freedom. The modern concept of freedom is this critical philosophy concept of freedom. Ancient concept of freedom, ancient philosophical concept of freedom. Aristotle, the philosopher, Muslim world, also the philosopher, the teacher, Aristotle. Freedom to be. So if something is able to be itself, if a seed is able to grow into the plant that it's meant to be, then it is free. If it's unhindered, unencumbered, unconstrained, if it's able to realize its essence, then it's free. Freedom to be. That's the ancient notion of freedom. Freedom to be. So Moses said to the Pharaoh, let my people go. What did that mean? Let my people be. As slaves, they can't practice their religion, they can't be who they are. Let us be, let us go. Modern concept of freedom, quite different. Freedom to change, freedom to become, freedom to transform. Meaning, we would not feel terribly free if all we could do is do exactly what our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did. We would not feel free. No, we want to be able to be different from our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. We want to be able to do something different. We want to be able to do something different from even in our own lives when we are becoming. Freedom to become. Freedom to bring forth the new and the different. And then the question is, but how does the new and the different emerge out of the given and the same? How does the process of becoming, of transformation, change, happen in a state of being? So some other language is nature and spirit. Some philosophical words. So they're capitalized. So nature isn't just physical or biological nature. It's everything that exists, including everything that has come into existence in the past. Everything cultural, historical, societal that exists now is natural to us. So second nature is also part of nature. History is part of nature. Spirit. What moves nature? What moves nature to transform, to change? The term Mrs. Hegel is Geist. Geist, which can be translated either as spirit or as mind, meaning our consciousness has something to do with this process of change. We are conscious because we can change. We're conscious in a way that the animals aren't, even though we are animals. But we're conscious in a way that the animals aren't, because we change in a way that the animals don't. Bees make the same beehive for millions of years. Humans make culture and society differently, radically differently over time. Some other language, the extant as opposed to the actual or actuality, which is different from a virtual actual distinction. So actuality, something is actually what it is, not merely as it exists, but as it might become. Different. The actuality of something is its latent potential. That's its truth. Truth of something is its actuality, not merely as it happens to exist. So this would be a little bit of Marxism. The truth of capitalism is socialism. Even though it doesn't exist. So Nietzsche. So becoming, the liability of the term becoming is that it suggests something that we're headed towards. It's actually the Marxist idea of socialism. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. We only know that it will mean the overcoming of capitalism. But we don't know what it will actually be. We only know that it's the overcoming of what is now. So self-overcoming, Selbstaufhebung. Aufhebung is a philosophical word that gets translated into a meaningless Latin word in English, sublation. Nobody knows what that means. In German, it's a normal word. Aufhebung is an ordinary word. It means to take up. So Selbstaufhebung, self-overcoming, to take oneself up. Philosophically, it means contradictory things. So why? Transformation is a funny thing for us to think about. It's hard for us to think about. Here, I'll put this out there. Language. The language that we're speaking, the language that we're thinking, the language that we're using is an ancient tool. It was designed to help cultures, peoples, maintain themselves as they were. It's not a tool for making change, making radical change, transforming, overcoming. It's not designed for that. It's designed for keeping things the way they are. Culture. Think about art and culture. What is culture? Cult? Culture? It's a cult. Culture is a cult. Religion? Religion is a cult. Culture. The first form of culture is religion. It's meant to maintain itself. It's meant to sustain itself. It's not meant to overcome itself. It's not at all. It's meant to preserve itself. So transformation makes us think two contradictory things at the same time that are hard for us to think at the same time. Continuity and change. For any transformation to take place, something has to exist that is being transformed. And yet, for it to be transformed, it no longer is what it was. So continuity and change. Is it the same? Is it different? Well, wait, it is the same thing, but it's different. It's hard for us to think these things at the same time. This is dialectics. And we think two contradictory things at the same time. And it's these contradictory things. What's the same? What's the different? What is changing. So, process of self-overcoming means two contradictory things. It means the fulfillment of something, also the negation of it. The fulfillment of its latent potential, the negation of what it merely is. The completion of something, which is also its transcendence. The realization of something, which is also its abolition. Now again, the thing we have in mind here is capitalism. So communism, socialism would be both the fulfillment of capitalism and its negation. It would be the completion of capitalism as well as its transcendence. It would be the realization of capitalism as well as its abolition. But not just that, because after all, philosophers who were dealing with this were not really concerned with capitalism. Kant and Hegel lived before capitalism. So what were they talking about? They were talking about forms, social forms, philosophical forms, practices, theories, understandings, and how they changed over time. Right? So philosophy transformed over time by fulfilling and negating itself through these radical revolutions in philosophy that overthrew the previous form and yet somehow sustained the practice of philosophy. Art continues by constantly overthrowing itself, by constantly overcoming itself, by constantly negating itself. All the anti-art movements that just become part of the history of art in the last century. All the attempts to not do art, happenings, performance, somebody having himself shot on the street, just becomes art. He's trying not to be art, he's trying to defeat art. Dadaism, not art. I'm going to read a train schedule as a poem. Not art. It's not art. No, it is art. And so the way things change. Christianity was the negation of Judaism? Well, no, it was the fulfillment of Judaism. It was the negation of Judaism. What is it? Protestant Reformation. Is that the overthrow of Christianity? Yes. It was also the preservation and transformation and continuance of Christianity. A more successful form of Christianity than the old form. Even though the old form was like, that's a heresy, that's total destruction of Christianity, which it was. And yet, it was the way Christianity went on. Right? This is the way history seems to move. According to Hegel, it might actually be the way history moves in capitalism. It may not actually be the way history moved before capitalism, but it's the way we think of change now. So that's what it means to live in a reality fraught with odds and tasked with change. And the difficulty of critical theory, critical philosophy, critical consciousness. How do we understand, recognize, participate in change? So that's really the issue of freedom. Again, not just shit happens, like random shit happens to us. That's not freedom. Freedom is when we can take responsibility for the process of change. When we can claim it's our own. That we're doing rather than it happening to us. And we're subjects of it, not objects of it. Even, and especially, we need to grapple with this, when we're alienated from the process of change, and it seems like it is happening to us and we're not doing it. Again, capitalism. Capitalism. What does it even mean to say that society is capitalist or suffers from capitalism? What the hell is capital? It's an alienated form of our own agency. So it's something that we're doing, and yet we're alienated from it, and so it seems to be a force of nature, it seems to be something coming from somewhere else. Technology. Heidegger was raised technology. Living in capitalism, it makes it seem like it's technology that's doing these things. Like AI is going to do something. No, AI is just us. It's just us. AI, it's not something else, it's us. We're doing it. But no, what is AI going to do? It's nothing. It's us. But we feel alienated from the result of our own action. And Heidegger built a whole philosophy of that. That humans create things, and then those things bite us in the ass. And everything is technology, right? Which is technology. Everything that we create bites us in the ass again. Who's a conservative? He's a reactionary. He's like, yeah, we've invented bad things. It would be nice to go back, but we can't, so we're stuck, we're fucked. That's how it is. The problem with these Marxists is that they're embracing this change and not recognizing how we're fucking ourselves. That's the mood. The mood is Heidegger, not Marx. That's the nihilism. The thing is, can we disalienate ourselves from the things that we're alienated from? Even calling it capital AR. Metaphysical, post-metaphysical philosophy, there is such a thing as capital AR. There is. There's a metaphysical object. There's a history of art. History is a metaphysical object. But if we treat it as an alienated thing, rather than something that we are doing, that we're participating in, that we're agents of, that we're subjects of, not objects of. And so again, why was there anti-art movements? Because it was like some bizarre anti-authoritarian gesture against the institution of art. No, art is just us. It's just what we're doing. So it's something that demands disalienation even when we experience it as alienating. Because we do. So again, that would be a function of this process of transformation that we might be in the midst of and that we feel alienated from. And that might be part of the truth of art in our time too. Art at the time of capitalism, modernism, might be all about this experience of art seeming to have a force of its own that we are subject to in some way, rather than subjects of. And that's the last thing that I want to talk about with you guys, which is even this language that we have in modernism and modernity. So we use these words interchangeably, but we should not. Maybe we should not. So modern is an ancient word. It just means now. It means current. And so it's present as opposed to past. So modern just means now as opposed to then. Modernity, which is a term coined by Charles Baudelaire, who we'll be reading, who was a poet, a writer, as well as an art critic and literary critic, and who coins the term modernity, but also initiates modernism. He doesn't use that word though. Modernity is not just the present relative to the past, but rather modernity is what is unique and specific and new and different about the present. So what is it about the middle of the 1800s that's different from any other time in history? Again, capitalism. It's unique and specific, new and different in modernity in the middle of the 1800s. Unlike anything that came before. Modernism is how we're tasked in response to modernity. So how should, in his case, how did you think artists and writers are tasked in their work to respond to the new and different, unique and specific conditioning of art? Something has changed. We can't go on doing the art and literature of the past. We would be true to ourselves, to our time. He collected his poems in a book called The Flowers of Evil. Why do you call it The Flowers of Evil? Because from any past standard, present society is evil. Including the bourgeois past, including like the Renaissance humanistic past. From any standpoint of any time in the past, our current situation is evil, harmful, immoral, bad. Or maybe we've changed our morality. Maybe what the ancients considered bad, we consider to be good. Maybe we have a new morality. Maybe what was evil is now good. And what was good is now evil. can recognize that too. What people in the past thought was morally good. Stoning prostitutes in the street. We think is evil. Our morality changes. Maybe our sense of the beautiful changes too. Maybe what was considered ugly is now our beauty. Our beauty would be considered ugliness from any other standpoint of cultures, peoples in the past. Modernism. Why is modernism ugly? So I was with my friends over at the Modern Wing of the Art Institute. They weren't sure how they felt about the stuff on the walls. It's kind of cool, it's kind of interesting, it's kind of, I don't know. I don't know what it is. Kind of ugly. No, it's beautiful. Right, but beautiful in a way that's kind of disturbing. It does something critical about that beauty. Modernism. And why did artists do that? Were they just fucked up? Were they like just damaged people? Maybe who isn't in this society? Not everyone becomes an artist, a successful artist. Not everyone makes great work, even if everybody is more or less pathological. My friends had questions. Who is this artist? What the fuck is he doing? Picasso. We could pathologize Picasso, or we could say it resonates, it speaks to us. Okay, so we sort of were kind of attracted, repulsed into it. Equal parts love and disdain, love hate. Right? They're kind of interesting, but we're kind of like, And of course, they wanted to go with me because they know that I'm an art institute professor and that I could have an informed experience of this stuff. I meant to take them through the 19th century stuff, taking and impressionist stuff, because I thought they could see more than they initially see. They could see the sort of picture postcard version of the painting first, and then maybe see more. There's more there than that. But we have the opposite experience. The 20th century modernist experience. All right. Next time, we're going to introduce some ideas. You'll see from the course description that there are some sort of classic debates, canonical debates that we have in the literature that are meant to help us grasp certain issues. So we're going to start with Habermas's Modernity and Incomplete project and Leotard, another French fry, responding to Habermas, what is postmodernism? So we'll see that Habermas has a critique of postmodernism and Leotard has a defense of postmodernism. They will be invoking Kant. So we will also read Kant's What is Enlightenment? And we'll read Foucault's response to Kant 200 years later. What is enlightenment? And we'll look at some prose poems, aphorisms from Baudelaire's Paris Wing to help illustrate. Then we will, after next week, we'll start at the beginning of the story. We'll go back historically to the early 18th century. And we'll deal with in Romanticism and the emergence of modernism. All right. Any intrepid volunteers to present next time? How else do you tell them how to do that? You're just interested. Daring. That's one. And one more. I think it was about 40-something years ago. Most of the authorities like eight. So Reagan and Thatcher and neoliberalism, postmodernism. And then Kant, we'll see public and private reason, public discourse. When we change our minds about things, what is enlightenment? And then Foucault. Foucault is going to bring it around to modernism, the relationship between Baudelaire and modernism and enlightenment. We'll see that Habermas has a critique of postmodernism. He says it's just another Baudelairean surrealist revolt in the realm of culture that leaves the economic, political, and social sphere untouched. Capitalism has periodic revolts, Baudelairean surrealist revolts that radicalize culture while leaving the basic structures of society, politics, and economy intact. And Leotard's like, no, it means a lot more than that. It's awesome. Really, nobody else? All right, we're done. Excellent, thank you.
What is the extent of like
What it involves?
here? Like what
Okay.
will we be doing?
So we have set up a discussion thread on Canvas, and then people will post, like I said, the volunteers will be obligated to post a few bullet points, like 3 or 4 points on the readings, and then in class, verbally presenting those points and elaborating, explaining. So again, it's meant to initiate our discussion. So not comprehensive, not summary. We're going to assume everybody's read. So everybody's read. So you don't have to summarize or be comprehensive at all. It's just what stood out to you in the reading, what would you like to discuss in class, what would you like to focus on. So that's really the point. It's not meant to be a summary or anything comprehensive. It's not like a paper or a lecture. All right. So have a good weekend. I'll see you guys next week.